Hello, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of the Cultureshock podcast, where me, your host Tank, goes through moments in pop culture that shocked the culture forever. For this episode this week, I wanted to give more of a chiller vibe, something a lot less educational and more of an opinion piece. This week, I wanted to go through and say some of my favorite albums of all time, and some of their cultural influence that they had behind them. The first album on my list is A Fever You Can't Sweat Out by Panic! At the Disco, the 2005 debut album for the band. This album, I think, perfectly demonstrates what it means to be a multi-genre rock album, blended within one genre throughout the album. In the beginning, it has a more of a dance, electronic feel, with a lot of rock elements put into place, with songs like Time to Dance, and songs like The Only Difference Between Marnum and Suicide is the press coverage. These albums blend a lot of what it meant to be emo rock at the time with elements that you can almost find nowhere else. Things that were almost made on a soundboard, things that you would dance to in Dance Dance Revolution. What makes this album super unique is that it's split up into two different albums combined into one. They have their first 7 songs, which are very dance-inspired. They have a lot of EDM elements, a lot of techno elements, but still have that hardcore emo rock feel. And then split up into a second side, which is a Baroque pop rock album. And if you don't know what Baroque pop is that almost circus core, very dark carnival, albums like that. There's not many of those that went mainstream like this one did. I can't think of any one that was a top 40 hit like this one was. But that side is something that truly was not really done in music at the time and definitely wasn't done after that was this successful. One of my favorite things about this album, besides the music, is the overall aesthetic of this album. Throughout it, even though it blends multiple genres, it has a continuous theme. You can really feel the atmosphere that the album is building, especially when you get to the second half past the intermission song. But they do have elements of that in the first half of the album. You can really put your eyes, if you close your eyes, you can really put yourself in the world that Panic! At the Disco is trying to explore in the album. The next album on my list is The Fame by Lady Gaga. This is her debut album that was released in 2008. This album holds a very special place in my heart because this was one of the first album cycles I can remember. I was born in 2003, so a lot of the older albums that I talk about and will talk about for the rest of this list, I was not necessarily there for. The Fame was the first time that I can remember seeing someone and being, this is a celebrity. And this was Lady Gaga's debut, like I've mentioned before. And she really mastered a debut album that would change the course forever. A lot of people like to say albums changed music forever, but this one is truly one that I can remember changing music forever. And from the beginning, it was a hit. Like, the first song that was put out from this album was Just Dance. And Just Dance, if you were there, you know. You know. If you were a person my age or a little bit older, this song defined us as a generation. And especially defined the older generation, talking about the millennials. But Gen Z really pushed the envelope of what we experienced growing up from this album alone. It really modernized dance pop. Dance pop has been, of course, a genre since the 60s with disco, but this really changed the trajectory of where music was going to go in the pop genre. With songs like Paparazzi, Love Game, Poker Face, those really take a very baseline, simple idea and turn it into these huge songs. If you listen to the melodies and listen to the lyrics, they're very simple. They're not very compact, but still have a thicker sound. It's almost like Lady Gaga took the rules of pop music and flipped them on their head. A sleeper hit on this album that I think deserves more attention is Boys, Boys, Boys. I found this song much later in life. I did not really know this song growing up, and I feel like it could have been another single. There are several songs, this whole album could have been produced as singles. And that is something that I appreciate. The album does, once again, have a huge theme and a huge togetherness, which makes it a good album. But all of these songs can stand alone. And I feel like a lot of albums, especially pop albums, struggle to have a lot of standalone hits that aren't particularly the singles of the album, and all of these songs can be a standalone hit by itself. Songs like The Fame and Again, and even Summer Boy, still to this day are everyday hits, and those songs were not even released with a music video, as a single. They did not even get discovered into the mainstream until much later, and that just shows the longevity of this song and this album. This album still feels very modern, which is something that is very hard to do, because music is always changing over time. But this album in particular, if you play this for anyone of any age, it's universal. It's an album that I feel everyone can enjoy, and that's what Lady Gaga was trying to put out. The next album on this list is After Laughter by Paramore, which was released in 2017. After Laughter is a very important album within Paramore's history. I'm a big Paramore fan. I've always been a big Paramore fan. I saw them in concert a couple years ago. I love Paramore. Paramore has made a huge impact in my life personally, and it probably forever will be. Until I'm like 80, I'll be listening to Paramore. But what makes this album so special, and so special to a lot of people, is if you know Paramore, you probably know them as this hard rock. They started out as a punk band and then moved into more of a rock and roll band in the traditional sense. They made very, very heavy music, instrumentationally and lyrically. They went to some darker places, but it was very relatable to a teen audience. Then they grew up a little bit and adapted with their audience. This album, I think, is the most adapted album for their audience, but what makes this album so special is it is not a rock album. This is a funk album, and not in the traditional way. There is some elements that people would not call it to be a funk album, but it is advertised as a funk album, which fits Paramore very well if you know the history of Paramore. Hayley Williams, the lead singer of Paramore, was originally a funk artist when she was like 12, but that's where she got her like roots. But what makes this album so special to a lot of people is the lyrical content within this album is completely different from what you would expect. All of this instrumentation is very classic 80s funk, very upbeat, very danceable, very happy instrumentation. But this album probably has some of the darkest lyrical content out of any Paramore album overall. Like, this album gets dark. It explores themes of depression, of abuse, of not having a will to go on anymore. Like, it goes very deep and dark into the emotions of the band members and the fear that the band members were experiencing at the time of writing this. This album was written when they were in their mid-20s, which is a very difficult time for a lot of people to navigate. You're not a kid anymore. You're becoming an adult for the first time. Actually an adult for the first time. You no longer have that young adult, that young label behind you. And that is also expressed through this. The fear of growing up is a big idea in this album, of keeping friends, of different stuff like that. But you would never realize that on first listen. This is an album that you truly have to dive into and read the lyrics, just dissect it outside of the context of just listening to this album in your car. The next album on my list is the Marshall Mathers LP, released in 2000. What really sets this album apart in my eyes is it really expands upon what a rap album can be. Yes, there is some more traditional songs of standard rap of the time, but there is songs like Stan and Kim that are barely even a song. It's more of story pieces. It's more of someone speaking as a narrator. It puts Marshall Mathers and separates him from the character that he was playing in the Eminem LP and puts him as a whole new person and more personal to what Marshall Mathers, who is the person who goes under the alias of Eminem, what he was personally going through in his real life was really illustrated throughout this album. One of my personal favorite things about this album is it really starts to define the characters of Eminem. A lot of people don't realize that Eminem is not just Eminem. He plays 3 different characters throughout his career. He plays Marshall Mathers, he plays Eminem, and he plays Slim Shady. This really defines that. There's songs that are clearly Slim Shady songs that are clearly Marshall Mathers songs, and they have 1 or 2 straight up Eminem songs. And I also find that really interesting throughout the album. My second to last album on this list is Discovery by Daft Punk, which came out in 2001. This album is revolutionary within its own right. It has songs that still hit to this day that people love, like One More Time, Digital Love, Harder, Better, Faster, Stronger, Crescendo Dolls, which are all great songs and songs that are really transitioning, especially in the dance world. This is an electronic pop album. It was very revolutionary for the time. It was something that people weren't doing. It was mixing elements from 70s and 80s grooves, which is a consistent thing that I've been talking about throughout this podcast episode today. But they, instead of being inspired by it, literally used it. They are electronic DJs. If you don't know who Daft Punk is, they are two EDM DJs, but they were very pioneers of the time. They were doing things that are now customary now. But what really makes this album super special is, along with an album, it was released as a movie. It was released as the movie Interstellar 5555. And this movie is completely silent. It is told through the music of Daft Punk. So when they were creating this album, they had to create a dance album with very little lyrics that still conveys a message that you can be seen through a movie. And it does that very well. Throughout the album, there's very highs, very lows, very sad, very happy, very fast, very slow, but with no lyrics. It is completely instrumentation and electronic. There is lyrics, I take that back, but the lyrics are not what is conveying the message. Of course, songs like One More Time, these super big hits, do have lyrics, but they are not what people are focusing on. It is about the dancing, it is about the beat behind it. So I think it is super impressive that they were able to convey an album that is very emotional. One of the most emotional albums I can think of, actually, that has very little lyrics. It was something that I think a lot of people found to be impossible up to this point. It was very daunting. It was something that people would not think was able to be done. And they did it. And they continue to be pioneers after this. They have had hits up until 2021 when they disbanded. It started in the 90s. But it all really started with this album getting super big. And I think on the EDM space, overall, the most influential album. Maybe even one of the most influential albums in music overall. And the last album I'm going to talk about, arguably one of the most important albums of all time, is Fleetwood Mac's Rumors, that was released in 1977. And if you know me in my personal life, you know how much I love this album. I have written papers on this album. I've sang this album live at events. This album has been such a big deal in my life, and a lot of people's lives, rightly so. This was Fleetwood Mac's sophomore album, and they had a really big act to follow with their self-titled debut. They had number one songs, and to put into perspective, number one songs were not easy to do back then. There was no virality. So you had to work and get lucky at that point. So they had a super big hit with their first album, and they wanted something to follow up, and they made this album. But what is so special about this album is it tells one cohesive story from several perspectives. This album really does tell the breaking up of divorce within band members who were in the band themselves. The album mainly follows Lindsey Buckingham and Stevie Nicks as their relationship ends, and it was going and being written at the same time that it was ending in their real life. There is songs on this album with words that have never been spoken to each other that were done through song. Songs like Go Your Own Way and songs like Dreams have never been said out loud with words, have only been sung, and were directly communicating what they were feeling on the inside about their relationships to each other in a way that they couldn't say with words. They can only write it. And going as far as to make the other person sing backup vocals on a song about you having a divorce with them was a task that was very daunting, obviously. It was something that not many people would be comfortable of doing. Your love of music overtries what you are feeling in your real life. And that really is shown throughout this entire album. Every song about triumph, divorce, drug addiction, everything is kind of put aside to be put into this music. They're pouring their hearts out. And it was almost said that it was silent in the writing room. It was silent. One person would go into the booth, write a song, leave. The people would sing it and perform it. And it was stuff that they were holding in for years, obviously. Divorce is not an easy thing, obviously. So putting it through this album and then releasing it to the public was something that completely changed the culture forever around soft rock music. This album is regarded as one of the most successful albums of all time. It was written over 50 years ago and still to this day has heavy impact on culture. And that's it for this week's episode of Culture Shock. Catch y'all next week where we talk about all things that have shocked the culture forever. Thank you so much for listening.